All right, let's roll. Solving quadratics by taking square roots. I wish we could just like factor all the time, but factoring doesn't work all the time. So if we had a problem like x squared minus, let's do plus 5x plus 10 equals 0, and I ask you, hey, solve that equation. The only way we've learned how to solve equations so far is by factoring. So we might try to factor this. You might say, okay, well, what can we multiply to get 10 that adds to give me 5? What can we multiply to get 10 that adds to give me 5? There's no number for the x squared. We don't need the box. So what can I multiply to get 10 that adds to give me 5? Well, the only two numbers that we can use are 1 and 10 and 2 and 5. Does any of those add up to 5? No, so we actually can't factor every single time. So this is not going to work. That's not possible. We can't factor that equation. So then we need other ways to solve equations, specifically quadratic equations. And the one way we're going to learn today is to solve by taking square roots. Solve by taking square roots. When can we use this method? When the equation is in vertex form, which would look something like a times x minus h squared plus k equals some number. So if it looks like that, we can use this, which is number 5 and 6 on your examples. So if you look down at 5 and 6, like, hey, that's vertex form. You have a number in front of the parentheses, you have a number inside the parentheses, you have a number outside the parentheses, and it's equal to some other number on the other side. Or when the equation is in standard form with no bx term. What does that mean? That would be something like ax squared, ax squared plus c equals some number. So we have a number in front of the x squared, we have a number after the x squared, and we have it equal to a number, but there is no x, right? Like this 5x is missing. And if that 5x is missing, we can solve by taking square roots. So how do we use this method? How do we solve by taking square roots? The first thing we want to do is isolate the squared term. And that seems really complicated, but it's really the same idea as this. If I had 5x plus 2 equals 22, and I asked you to solve for x, this is really all step 1 is asking you to do, get x by itself. We're just going to get x squared by itself. So what I might do to get x by itself, I might subtract 2 for both sides. The 2's cancel out. We get 5x equals 20. The 5 and the x are being multiplied together. So in order to get rid of the 5, we might divide by 5. And we get x equals 4. So that's really all step 1 is asking you to do. It's no more complicated than what we just did. It might say x squared instead of x. But we do it the exact same way. Okay, we're going to do it the exact same way. We're going to get x squared or x minus h squared by itself. Step 2, in order to get rid of the squared, we can take the square root of both sides. We'll talk about the plus or minus in a second. Step 3 is going to be done most of the time, but sometimes it won't, depending on what the initial question looked like. And step 4, simplify the answer. We're going to let our calculator today do a lot of the simplifying for us, okay? Yes, we could simplify it by hand. No, we're not going to spend time simplifying things by hand. Your calculator will simplify everything we're going to do today for you. All right, example number 1. What are we trying to do in number 1? In number 1, we're trying to get this x squared piece by itself. Trying to get x squared by itself. So the 5 and the 6 got to go. The 5 and 6 are going to go the same way the 5 and the 2. Okay, same way. So we're going to subtract 5 from both sides. We get 6x squared. The 5's cancel out. 155 minus 5 is 150. So we get 6x squared equals 150. The 6 is being multiplied by the x squared. So to move the 6 to the other side, we would divide by 6 on both sides. The 6's cancel out. We get x squared equals 150 divided by 6. Type that in the calculator if you need to. That is 25 in this case. That's 25. Now, it's not just x, it's actually x squared. So what can we do to both sides of the equation to get rid of the squared? We can take the square root of both sides. The square root and the squared actually cancel each other out. If you think about it, like, hey, what's 3 squared? 9. Well, what's the square root of 3? Or the square root of 9, rather? 3. So we get right back to where we started. So if we square root something that's being squared, they essentially just cancel each other out. And we get x equals 5. But every single problem we solved so far, every single quadratic equation we solved so far had 2 answers. All of those on that wall had 2 answers. Almost all of them on this wall had 2 answers. One of them had 1 answer, but you got the same answer twice. So it technically had 2 answers. If I'm looking at this, I only have 1 answer. How do I know I'm going to have 2 answers? It's x to the second power. If I just had x, I would have 1 answer. If I had x to the third, I would have 3 answers. If I had x to the fourth, I would have 4 answers. So I need 2 answers here. Where are the 2 answers going to come from? And it's from the square root piece. What's the square root of 25? The square root of 25 is 5 because 5 times 5 is 25. But what about negative 5? What if we were to take negative 5 and multiply it by negative 5? Wouldn't we also get 25? Yes. So anytime we take the square roots, we technically need to take the positive and the negative square roots. And you can write that separately. You could write x equals positive 5 and x equals negative 5 if you would like. So don't forget, when we take the square roots, we need to take the positive and negative square roots, not just the positive side. So we're done with number 1. Number 2, these problems do get a little bit more difficult as we move down the page, but the process is the same. We're going to add 4 to both sides. The 4s are going to cancel out. 521 plus 4 is 525. We're going to divide by 7. 525 divided by 7, type that in the calculator. I probably would need to if I hadn't done this 12 times today already. 525 divided by 7 is 75. So everybody should at least be able to get to that point, because, I mean, that's no different than what we did in like 7th or 8th grade when you first started learning how to solve equations. And then how can we get rid of the squared? We can get rid of the squared by taking the square root. When we take the square root, we want to go ahead and put the plus or minus there. We don't want to wait till we get like all the way down to our final answer. And maybe I got like 7 as the answer, and then I just make it plus or minus 7. Sometimes that'll work, but not always. So be careful there. Now we want to simplify this. The square root and the square root cancel each other out. I want to simplify the square root of 75. I don't want the decimal for that. We want the exact value solution, because square root of 75 is going to be a decimal that actually goes on forever. We call those numbers irrational numbers. And you actually can't write down every single decimal. So you'll have to round it if you write down decimals. And in math, we don't really like to round if we can avoid it. So we're just going to type square root of 75 in our calculator, or we're going to do the whole factor tree thing. Remember the whole factor tree? We would do that, or we would just type it in my calculator. And your calculator should say 5 square root of 3. I believe. If that's not right, let me know. I'm pretty sure that's the idea there. All right, number 3. You try to get x squared by itself in number 3. Maybe try to type it in your calculator if you want, but we don't want the decimal. We don't want the decimal. We're not trying to get decimals today. So if you get a decimal, just hang tight, and I'll show you how to type it in the calculator so that you do not get a decimal. So that you do not get a decimal. I want to use this today. It is arranged a little bit differently. The x squared is, that's the only, I mean, I got these, but they're not going to do the square root thing for you. They'll add, subtract, and multiply, but they're not going to do the square root thing. So these are arranged a little bit differently. The x squared is second instead of first, but same idea. We're going to subtract 9 from both sides. we get negative 3x squared equals negative 19. We can divide both sides by negative 3. The negative 3 cancel out. You can type negative 19 over negative 3 in your calculator if you want. If you get a fraction, just leave it as a fraction, because we said we don't want decimals. And if you try to type the square root of a decimal in your calculator, it's always going to give you a decimal answer. And we said we're trying to avoid decimals today. So we get 19 over 3, because like negative divided by a negative is a positive. And we can get rid of the x squared by taking the square roots of both sides. Taking the square root of both sides, the square and the square root cancel each other out. And we get x equals plus or minus the square root of 19 over 3. That is the right answer. But that's not how the answer is going to look on a multiple choice test. We need to type it in our calculator. But if you try to type that in your calculator, what's going to happen? It probably gave you a decimal. So there is a way that I can type this in the calculator. It will simplify it for me, and I will not get a decimal. So what do you need to type in the calculator? I'm just going to put the plus and minus here. You need to hit the fraction button first. Not the square root button first, but the fraction button first. And we're going to put the square root of 19 on top and the square root of 3 on the bottom. And now when you type that in, it doesn't give you a decimal. It actually gives you a fraction. And this is the answer choice that you would want to pick. That's what the answers on a quiz or test or your classwork, when you check your classwork today, that's what the answer is going to look like. And if you don't have one of these calculators that will do this simplifying for you, I would recommend finding one, buying one, borrowing one, using somebody's in this class, especially when we're doing classwork. Y'all can just share. And if you can't afford to buy one, send me an email. Hey, Mr. Washington, I really can't afford a calculator. What, can you get me one? I will find you a calculator. Whether I buy it, rent it from the library, something, I will find you a calculator. Okay? So if you can't afford one, send me an email. I'll find you a calculator that will simplify that for you. But we got to know how to type it in. If we try to type it in this way, never going to get it to look like that. All right, number 4. These are getting a little more difficult as we go. The process, again, is still the same, but the answers are getting a little more complicated. Like, I'm doing the same stuff, but my answers just keep getting more and more complicated. Like, we got a whole number, we got a square root, we got a square root and a fraction. What are we going to get this time? So we subtract 4, we get negative 14. We divide by 8, and we get x squared equals negative 14 over 8. We can go ahead and type that in the calculator if you want to and simplify that. You don't necessarily have to, because we're going to type it in the calculator in a minute anyway. But if you want to go ahead and type that in, we can go ahead and type that in, and we get negative 7 over 4. Because we can divide both of those by 2. Now, maybe you remember, maybe you don't remember. Hopefully you do. We're going to take the square root of both sides. We're going to take the square root of both sides. So here and here, I guess. The negative 14 over 8, which is kind of in the middle. So we get x equals plus or minus the square roots of negative 7 over 4. How should we type that in the calculator? If I try to type the fraction in the calculator, it's going to give me a decimal. So maybe we should break this apart. Plus or minus the square root of negative 7 over the square root of 4. But if you typed that in your calculator exactly like I just wrote on the board, there is no plus or minus button. You don't need to worry about that part. Just type in square root of negative 7 over square root of 4. Your calculator probably screamed at you like, I can't do that. I can't do that. So does anybody remember why your calculator will not actually calculate that today? The square root is negative, absolutely. And a couple weeks ago, we took a quiz, I think like 2 weeks ago maybe. We took a quiz, and on that quiz, we had something like the square root of negative 50. Number 1 on your quiz, I think it was square root of negative 50. What did we say our answer is going to be? Our answer is actually an imaginary number at that point. And what can we do? We can type the square root of positive 50 in our calculator, but we need to know that our answer is going to have an I attached to it. Well, that's the same idea here, and that's why we learned those imaginary numbers 2 weeks ago, so that when I got to solving these equations and these imaginary solutions showed up, maybe we remember doing that. So what can you type in the calculator? At this point, I would type positive square root of 7 over positive square root of 4, and then I know my answer has to have an I somewhere. The I can go anywhere but the denominator. The I will not go in the denominator. So if you type square root of 7 over square root of 4, it will simplify it for you, and we will get the answer that we're looking for. So plus or minus, you should have got the square root of 7 over 2. And where can we put the I? We talked about before, the I can either go like after the square root or in front of the square root. Do I care where you put it? Not really. I'm going to put it right here, but if you want to put it right there, you can put it right there too if you want. Just depends on who wrote it and which one they prefer. All right, so that was number 4. 2 more today, and then you should have quite a bit of time to work on your classwork. So what are we trying to get by itself in this problem? It's not just x squared anymore, but it's actually x minus 4 squared. We want to get all of that by itself, because all of that is being squared. So that plus 2, we need to move it to the other side. So we're going to subtract 2 from both sides. So literally, this is the same thing we did before. It looks a lot different because it's not just x squared anymore. It's x minus 4 squared, but we need to move it. And now how might we get rid of the squared? I can't move the 4 yet because it's being squared, but I can get rid of the squared first, and then we can worry about the 4 after we get rid of the squared. So how do we get rid of the squared in all the other problems? We took the, well, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take the square roots. The squared and the square root are going to cancel each other out. So the left side is just x minus 4. I'm going to take the square root of the right side, and this is where like it was really like all the other ones didn't really matter, but this is the one that it really matters that, hey, where's the plus or minus go? The plus or minus goes as soon as we take the square root. We don't want to do everything and get down to our final answer and say, okay, well, it's going to be plus or minus that number. No, not quite. The plus or minus comes in as soon as we take the square root of both sides. And what is the square root of 25? It is 5, but it is plus or minus 5. And that's really important that we put the plus or minus now and not later. We don't want to put the plus or minus later. Now, all the other problems we did so far, x was already by itself. But in this case, x is not by itself. So how are we going to move the minus 4 to the other side? We're just going to add it. So plus 4 to both sides. So we get x equals 4. We typically put the number in front. We put the plus or minus sign in the middle. Typically, we put the plus or minus sign in the middle. Now, I don't have any square roots left over. And if you don't have any square roots left over, we can actually figure out what those two numbers are. It's a lot different than like if I had 4 plus or minus the square root of 5. If I had 4 plus or minus the square root of 5, we would be done. Like, I don't know what 4 plus square root of 5 is, but I do know what 4 plus 5 is. So what is 4 plus 5? 4 plus 5 is 9. And I do know what 4 minus 5 is. So on a quiz or test that's multiple choice, 9 and negative 1 is what the correct answer choice would look like. It would not look like 4 plus or minus 5. You're not going to find that as one of the answer choices for a problem that ended up like this. So if the square roots go away completely, we need to know what those numbers are. Now, what if you had put the plus or minus at the end? You would have got 9, and you said, oh, well, it's just positive 9, negative 9. That's not right. The plus or minus has to go here, not at the very, very end. All right, last one today. We got to get the x plus 1 squared by itself. So the 3 and the 17, we're going to move those to the other side the same way we've done on all of the other problems today. Literally the exact same way. It looks a little bit different, but we're going to do it the exact same way we did all these other problems today. We're going to subtract 17. So we get 3 times x plus 1 squared equals negative 23 minus 17 is negative 40. we are going to divide by 3. We're going to divide by 3. So we get x plus 1 squared equals, type that in the calculator if you want, but it actually can't be simplified. So we're just going to leave it negative 40 over 3. And how are we going to get rid of the squared? Square root, good. So far so good. Like, we haven't not done all this several times today so far. We get x plus 1 equals, and here's where the plus or minus comes in. Plus or minus. What are you going to type in your calculator so that your calculator will simplify the square root of negative 40 over 3 for you? If you put the negative in there, it's going to give you domain error 100% of the time. So here's what you should type in the calculator. We should type square root of positive 40 over the square root of positive 3. And we know that answer should have an I in it. So in your calculator, you're going to type in positive 40 on top, square root of positive 40, and square root of 3 on the bottom. It's going to simplify it for you. It's going to simplify that for you. And honestly, I don't remember what this one equals, so we'll figure it out right quick. We get 2 square root of 30 over 3. So we get x plus 1 equals plus or minus 2 square root of 30 over 3. Now, is x by itself? No, x is not by itself yet. So we need to subtract 1 from both sides. And typically the plus or minus sign always goes in the middle. So x equals, I'm going to put the negative 1 first, the plus or minus sign, 2 square root of 30 over 3. Now, if this question was not multiple choice, I'd probably give you full credit for that because that's 100% correct. But a lot of times, if it's multiple choice, they take these two numbers and they actually combine them into one fraction. Guess what? Your calculator will do that for you. So here's what you want to type in your calculator. If you hit negative 1 plus, and then you actually go back up, and where it says the 2 square root of 30 over 3, you can actually go back up and highlight that. Type the negative 1 plus, go back up and highlight that and hit enter, and it's going to bring this down here for you. You don't have to type it all back in. Could you just type it all back in? You could. And now what does your calculator say? Your calculator says, your calculator should say something that looks like this. It's going to say 2 square root of 30 minus 1 all over 3, or it's going to say negative 2 square root of 30. If you change the plus sign to a minus sign, it would look like this. It would look like that. But typically, the square root always comes last. I do not know, and this is the only thing I don't like about this calculator, is that when I do something like this, it automatically puts the square root in the front. And every single piece of material, book, video, website, whatever you might go look at, the square root's always going to be at the back. So the final answer that you might see on a multiple choice test, the negative 1's going to go in the middle. Not negative 1, I'm sorry, this should be a 3. I lied to you guys. That should be a 3. So negative 3 plus or minus 2 square root of 30 all over 3. So that's the answer that we would want. I lied to you guys about the 1 earlier. It should have been a 3. So this should have been a 3, and that should have been a 3. So this is what your calculator is going to say, but you should be able to recognize that that and that are the same. Just put the negative 3 in the front. Where'd the I go? Where'd the I go? The I did not just disappear. It should be here. It should be here. It should be here. It should be there. And it should also be there. I just forgot to write it. So don't forget to write it. I just forgot to write it. But it definitely should still be there. Yeah, it should definitely still be there. I just forgot to write it. That's my bad.